So welcome to today's event. I'm Gemma Monk-Hartley and I am from Herefordshire Green Networks Building Sense Group, which is an initiative that was started back in 2020 to bring together people, information and professional expertise to help with the challenge of making homes more comfortable year-round in the face of high heating bills and, of course, cutting carbon emissions. Today, we're delighted to be hosting Jeremy Brignell-Thorp on behalf of the Future Ready Homes programme. Future Ready Homes is running across Shropshire, Powys and Herefordshire. It's being delivered by March's Energy Agency and 7Y Energy Agencies, with support of groups such as ourselves, HGN in Herefordshire, Lightfoot in Powys and Zero Carbon Shropshire in, of course, Shropshire. The main focus of the programme is to promote and support good practice energy retrofit of homes across the Marches area. They're doing this through a webinar series, which is why we're here today, retrofit advice, green doors, which is something that's coming up in October and I'll tell you about a bit later, and with the provision of now a very small number of free energy surveys and retrofit plans. If you are interested in those surveys and plans, they are looking for a good cross-section of building types and situations. So not everyone who applies will get one, especially as the numbers are limited, but you can still apply and I will share details after the event. So today we've got Jeremy with us. He is by training a mathematician, so he's going to be bringing very much a quantitative approach to the topic of carbon emissions and heating with wood. He's worked in the past in the fields of high voltage transmission with National Grid, community renewable energy with Share Energy, and retrofit advice as a domestic energy assessor with March's Energy Agency and Lightfoot Enterprises. But he's currently a councillor on Powys County Council. His Welsh home is mainly heated with wood, but he's been taking the opportunity to have a critical view on whether that's actually the best long-term solution from a cost, carbon and health perspectives as well. So this should be a really interesting talk. So Jeremy, thank you ever so much and please take over.
Okay, thanks very much, Gemma. I assume you can all hear me okay. Right, I can't screen share at the moment. I think you have to stop yours before I can share mine. Right, it's still not letting me screen share mine. Ah, there we go. Let me try again now. Yeah, where's my screen share gone? Excuse me while I get this just working.
Yeah, no problem.
It's definitely opening another window. Ah, there we go. There it is. Right, can you all see that screen now? Okay, should have a title slide there. Is that okay?
Yeah,
right,
good.
jolly good. So thanks, Gemma, for the introduction. So you've said a lot of what I was going to say anyway. So yeah, that sort of background of a bit of well, I've been trusted with Lightfoot Enterprises, and Lightfoot have been doing home energy, domestic energy surveys and advice for 15 years or so. So I've got that experience with Lightfoot, and as Gemma said, 10 years or so with Share Energy doing supporting community energy renewables. So I've got a bit of sort of renewable energy background as well. But yeah, by training, I'm a mathematician, but sort of regard myself as a bit of a sort of amateur scientist as well. So it's that sort of angle that I'll be looking at a bit from this point of view. At the moment at home, we in fact, most of our heating comes from a log stove at present, with a bit of supplement from electric heaters from when we absolutely need it. And we did have an oil Rayburn that we stopped using a couple of years ago because it was just old and inefficient. And so we're sort of looking to see what we can do to improve our home heating. But I don't sell or install log stoves. I don't sell firewood. So hopefully I've approached this from a relatively sort of impartial point of view, without sort of having any particular axe to grind, other than needing to heat our own home with something or other. So that's my background. So I thought I'd start off by just getting a sort of common understanding of what actually a fire comprises, what's happening in a fire. And it's quite useful to start off by thinking about what happens when a candle burns, which we're all obviously very familiar with. And what's basically happening with a candle is that you've got it's not the wick itself isn't what's burning. What's burning is the wax, the melted wax. So the heat from the candle melts and then vaporizes the wax, which forms a flammable gas. And it's that flammable gas that you see burning in the flame. And the yellow color of the flame is because you've got tiny particles of carbon there, which glow when they're hot and as they're burning themselves. And interestingly, scientists don't seem to fully understand the formation of soot, the particles of carbon in a flame. And what's happening in a flame is that the wax, which is basically a long chain of carbon, will be breaking up into smaller pieces, and then eventually the carbon oxidizes to CO2. So at some stage, it seems that carbon atoms seem to sort of coalesce together to form soot, and that some of that soot is then burnt to form CO2, and some of it escapes into the atmosphere to form pollution. And it's a question of sort of how much forms heat and how much forms pollution. So that's basically what's happening in a candle. You've got wax vaporizing, burning as a gas, and then becoming CO2 and water. So a log is actually not that much different. What happens when a log heats up is that the log is basically a whole complicated collection of complicated hydrocarbons. But basically, when they heat up, they start to vaporize, or a lot of the component materials in a log starts to vaporize, forms a flammable gas, and it's that gas that is what you see forming the flames in a fire. And what's happening is those carbon chains in the log are breaking down into sort of shorter carbon chains and all burning in the gas. And I think the critical thing here to think about is that you've got this flammable gas being given off by the log, and some of it is burning and forming heat and forming CO2 and just spraying up the chimney. But there is the potential for some of this flammable gas to escape without being burned. Some of the compounds that are being formed are actually quite heavy, the sort of tars and creosotes and so on that we associate with flues. That's because those are the compounds that are created when the log is getting hot. And if those do burn completely, then they burn and form just the completely innocuous compounds such as carbon dioxide and water. But if they don't burn completely, they end up escaping from the flames, going up your flue and coating your flue with tar and creosote and emitting themselves to the atmosphere and forming pollution in the atmosphere and forming soot in your chimney as well. So what I'm really emphasizing here is that a crucial thing, both from the point of view of energy efficiency and from the point of view of pollution, is to try and make sure that you don't end up with unburnt fuel in that fire, because it is damaging from both the energy efficiency and the pollution point of view. But that's basically what's happening when a log burns. You've got these flames formed from the burning gases. And just to sort of go through that a bit more, this is the only slide that there is with a bit of chemistry on it, but basically that wood is long chains of carbon atoms all joined together. A lot of it is in the form of various complex carbohydrates. They will break down, the carbon will recombine with oxygen to form CO2, the hydrogen will recombine with oxygen to form water, but some of those long carbon chains will escape unoxidized, and that will form air pollution. Some of the carbon will coalesce as soot, and they will either burn or they will just be emitted as soot into the atmosphere. And it's soot, or as they're called, sort of particulate matter, that are some of the worst of the pollution elements to try and avoid. Really, to avoid this, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that we need to make sure that when you're burning wood, that the fire is kept hot with plenty of oxygen, so that we aim for complete combustion. Because basically, when all of these things burn completely, when we have them in a hot fire with complete combustion, then the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water, which, other than the climate change effect, are fairly harmless. They don't form any pollution. But if we have incomplete combustion, then we end up with sort of the serious problems of air pollution. Just to expand on this slightly further, when wood burns, you've actually got two stages of burning. The first stage is the one I've really been describing mainly so far, is when the volatile components of the wood, that is the components that will vaporize when they're heated up, they're driven off and they oxidize and burn, and that's when the fire has flames. It's basically those volatile components being driven off as vapor and burning. Once that first stage has happened, once you've driven off all of the volatile components, what you're left with is a charcoal, which is basically almost pure carbon. Now, charcoal won't vaporize. So what happens when charcoal burns is that it just the pure carbon oxidizes to CO2 while it's still in its solid form. So it burns without any stage of flames. And that's why you obviously use charcoal in things like barbecues, because it burns and you get the heat without that the gas stage and the soot and so on, which would otherwise damage your food on the barbecue. But again, the critical thing to think about here is that carbon actually needs to be hot in order to burn. So if the fire is too cool, you will end up with quite a lot of that charcoal still in the ash, unburned. If your ash is black, then it means that you've not burnt all of the carbon that's available. So again, it's another reason why the fire has to be hot in order for it to burn efficiently. So that was just a bit of general background on really the importance of making sure that you do really have a hot fire that is going to burn efficiency. The next few slides, in fact, come from this very useful website. I'd recommend people having a look at it, durofire.com. It's actually a Danish website for somewhere that's selling stoves, but they've got quite a lot of useful information on there about all things to do with making sure that you're burning wood in an efficient way. But I've just picked out a few bits that I thought were quite useful, just to again sort of emphasize how to get the most out of a log fire. So the first slide here, they basically highlighted some, or reporting on some scientific experiments that were being done, burning wood with different moisture contents, because we're often told, yeah, you've got to burn dry wood, and this really examines what the effect is of burning wood with too much of a moisture content. So what they've done here is they've the experimenters burnt wood on a log stove with different moisture contents. So you can see down the left-hand side, they've used moisture content of 12%, 20%, and 30% moisture. And then you've got the results showing what that ended up with in terms of the efficiency and the pollutants of carbon monoxide and particulates. And so you can see there that going from 20% moisture content to 30% moisture content has dropped your efficiency from 63% to 39%, which is, that's you're getting only 2/3 of the amount of heat from your wood if you're burning it at a 30% moisture content compared to a 20% moisture content. And the reason being, it's not just that. So people often think about wet wood as being, well, you've got to evaporate the water away, but it's not just that. It's also that the moisture is causing the fire to burn cooler, and that's ending up with a lot of these problems that I talked about earlier in terms of more of the carbon, more of the fuel escaping without being burned. And then if we look at the carbon monoxide, so going from 20% to 30%, again, we've got 3 times as much carbon monoxide being formed from the wet wood compared to the dry wood. And with particulates, it's even worse. That particulates, that by that we mean the soot and so on, that's gone up over tenfold. going from the dry wood to wet wood. So this is really emphasizing that it's really very important to make sure that you burn dry wood, really, so that you can make sure the fire is burning hot. And that really means that to wait at least a year, preferably 2 years, to allow your wood to season before you're going to be burning it. Slightly different experiment here, also from the same website. This is looking at the ideal size of logs to burn on a fire, which we tend not to think about very much, actually. But they did some experiments with some different sizes of logs. You can see there that they have got logs that are around about 0.5 kilo, and then a bit over 1 kilo, and then a bit over 2 kilos that they've experimented with. Efficiency hasn't changed. Well, efficiency has changed a bit. Going from the 1 kilo ones to the 2 kilo ones, you've dropped by 8 percentage points in terms of efficiency, but your carbon monoxide and particulates have gone up quite significantly as well. And I think this is because basically with the larger logs, it's less capable of actually reaching the efficient combustion temperatures. So yeah, even if you've got a log stove that you think, oh, that's a big log stove, I can put really big logs in there, it is actually quite important to keep your logs at an ideal size. So this is recommending, you know, a kilo-ish for your logs. And in fact, even if you go to very small logs, then you start to lose a tiny bit of efficiency, and you're getting more particulates from very small logs as well. So there is an ideal size of log, really, to make sure that the fire is burning hot and efficiently. So sort of summarize, the fire needs to be kept hot so that you don't get hydrocarbons vaporizing and disappearing up the chimney, forming tar and soot and everything, which increases the risk of a chimney fire. So ideally, you shouldn't be having any smoke from your fire. There's usually a lot of smoke when it's sort of starting to when you're lighting it, but once the fire is going really well, you shouldn't really see any smoke coming from the chimney if your fire is burning efficiently. How to control the fire to maximum benefit. This is actually quite a challenging topic to cover because it's so variable and stoves are all different. So it's hard to sort of give you a very specific ABC on what to do to control the fire. Basically, you've got air vents, and the more air you put through the fire, the quicker it'll burn, and the less air, the less it'll burn. Now, one interesting thing here is that if you remember when I mentioned earlier, I said that wood starts off by burning by forming a gas, a flammable gas, and it's that gas that burns. Whereas when you get to the charcoal, with the charcoal, it actually burns, the carbon burns without vaporizing, so it burns within the charcoal itself. And that's why, in fact, when people talk about air supply in log stoves, the theory is that if you're burning coal or charcoal, coal is very similar to charcoal in its sort of chemistry, you would want to take air from below because it's the burning, the combustion takes place within the fuel itself. Whereas for wood stoves, they're generally supplied with air that comes from above, the secondary air that comes from above, because it's the gas that is basically burning when you're burning wood. So for log stoves, as I say, you tend to have, well, quite often they have air coming from below and from above, but the air coming from above is because of this need to burn the vapor, the gases that come off the wood. So generally, too little air, you don't get complete combustion. Too much air means that it's not a good thing because the heat is disappearing up the chimney before it's had a chance to actually for that heat to transfer to the walls of the stove and out into the room. So we want to have a happy medium. I find the best rule of thumb on this is that you need lots of air to get the fire going, but once you've got a hot core of the fire, once you've got a really hot fire in the middle there, to wind down the air until just such a point that the hot core would start to reduce slightly. So you want to really have the minimum air that's going through to maintain a really hot fire, which would generally be, you know, the controls might be half open, say. You wouldn't generally run the log stove with the vents fully open, even if you want it to be as hot as possible, because the vents fully open is really all what you'd need when you're starting the fire, when you need lots of air. So once you've got that happy medium, you can vary the controls up or down slightly to control the heat output, but try and avoid opening the controls wide or closing them right down. What's the most efficient stove? Again, it's quite a difficult question to answer, because stoves are notoriously difficult to measure, and certainly until very recently wouldn't have had any efficiency sort of data on stoves that are available. But the regulations have been improving quite significantly over recent years. In fact, since January 22, all new stoves have to comply with an EU design standard that says they have to have a seasonal efficiency of at least 65%. So generally, modern stoves are designed to be more energy efficient than old ones. But quite how efficient your old stove is very difficult to establish. But I would suggest that if your stove is more than sort of 20 years old or so, it may well be a good idea to replace it with a one that does comply with the new design standards, because this is a topic that I think designers have tried to focus on, especially in recent times. Freestanding stoves, slightly more efficient than inset ones. But all of this is, of course, caveated with the fact that a lot depends on how you actually use the stove and what sort of fuel you have on it. There's no point having a modern eco-design stove if you're putting wood on it or not operating it very efficiently. So in general, yes, new stoves are quite a bit better than the old ones. Whether you should replace your old one with a new one is a difficult question to answer, but I'd say yes, if it's significantly old, then you would probably, and you rely on that stove for quite a lot of your heating, then it might be sensible to get a modern stove. Heating water, there is this question about whether it's worth having a back boiler on a stove. I must admit, my own experience on this is that the back boiler does tend to cool down the combustion chamber quite a lot, which will then tend to lower the efficiency of a stove. When we had a stove with a back boiler, it was quite hard to get the fire burning really hot and bright, and the glass tended to soot up quite significantly. And we eventually decided to disconnect the back boiler and empty it and just run it without a back boiler. And the fire seemed to burn much hotter, and the glass didn't soot up as much. So my experience is that a back boiler isn't necessarily or will reduce the efficiency of your stove. So unless you really need the back boiler for water heating, you've got free wood, my recommendation is it's probably better to have a stove without a back boiler and to heat your water some other way, even if that's with an immersion heater, unless it's really something that you're passionate about, that you want to use to heat hot water. If it's a boiler, a log boiler that's specifically designed to heat hot water for central heating, then it will probably be designed to have the heat exchanger somewhere where it's not going to affect the actual temperature of the firebox itself so much. And I think if you've got a boiler that's designed in that way, then it can still be efficient. But if it's basically a log stove with a back boiler bolted to the back of it directly to the combustion chamber, my impression is that it will reduce the efficiency of the stove. Right, moving on to where you get your firewood from. So a lot of people seem to get their wood in dumpy bags these days. That seems to be the standard way of buying it. A dumpy bag is not a cubic meter. It's about 0.7 of a cubic meter. And typically for a dumpy bag of hardwood at a 20% moisture content, it will contain about 200, just a bit over 200 kilos of firewood. And taking as a rule of thumb that you would have about 4.1 kilowatt hours of heat in a kilo of wood, that equates to about 820 kilowatt hours, according to my calculator. And if we assume that a typical house in the UK will have a heat requirement of about 12,000 kilowatt hours, I think that's the typical gas consumption of UK properties, then you're going to need sort of 12 to 15 dumpy bags of logs in order to provide the same sort of heating that you would get from a 12,000 kilowatt hours of gas heating. And if you're buying fuel by the dumpy bag, so my calculations, if you're paying £50 for a dumpy bag of wood, then that works out to a basic cost of about 6p per kilowatt hour of gross heat. That would be if you were able to use 100% of the heat from that wood. And obviously, if you're paying £100 a dumpy bag, it's going to cost you 12p per kilowatt hours. Now, log stoves are not 100% efficient. The best you can probably look to get is about 70% efficient. The other 30% will be disappearing up the chimney. And if you factor that in, then if you're paying 6p for the gross heat output, then that comes down to about 9p per kilowatt hour for the usable heat, if you're paying £50 a dumpy bag, or 18p per kilowatt hour of usable heat if you're paying £100 per dumpy bag. On an open fire, obviously the figures are even worse, where you're probably paying, those equivalents would be 20p or 40p per kilowatt hour for the heat. Now, bear in mind at the moment that the cost of oil is around about 60p a litre, and that equates to about 6p per kilowatt hour of gross heat, and an oil boiler is usually about 90% efficient, so you're probably paying sort of 7 or 8p per kilowatt hour for usable heat from a gas boiler. Wood is a similar sort. If you're buying wood reasonably cheaply by the dumpy bag, you're probably paying a similar price to what you are with an oil boiler. But if you're paying sort of quite a lot per dumpy bag and your log stove is not very efficient, then you're likely to be paying more than you would be paying for oil from from an oil boiler. If we go to other ways of buying firewood, net of logs, which you can see for sale at fire stations, garages, forecourts, and so on. Just looking at how much that costs. This is a price I got from the internet of an 8.5 kilo bag. Net's costing £7.50. Taking this same assumption of 4.1 kilowatt hours per kilowatt, comes up with a cost of heat of 30p per kilowatt hour. Now compare that with an electric fire, where you're paying about probably 30 to 40p per kilowatt hour for an electric fire. So a net of logs is costing the same as you just using a standard electric fire. So yeah, not a cheap form of heat. Briquettes, again, I got a price from the internet here, the best price I could find on the internet, which was around about £120 for 100 kilos of briquettes. Now, briquettes do have a slightly higher heat content than logs. They seem to be, briquettes and pellets seem to generally have about 4.8 kilowatt hours per kilo of briquettes, compared to 4.1 that is the sort of rule of thumb for logs. I think because they're sort of compressed and dried rather more than logs would be. But if you're paying £120 for 100 kilos for briquettes, that's working out at about 25p per kilowatt hour of gross heat, which is up to sort of 35p per kilowatt hour if you're burning them on a log stove at 70% efficiency. So again, if you're buying briquettes and burning them on a log stove, then you're probably paying as much as you would be just having electric fire on. Just a bit of word about waste wood. There is quite a lot of waste wood that's still going into landfill or being incinerated. So the estimates online seem to be that there's around about 4.5 million tonnes of waste wood created in the UK each year, which is enough for quite a lot of homes. And much of that goes to, or some goes to electricity generation via incineration and manufacture of MDF, but there is quite a lot of waste wood around. So if you can get waste wood, then at relatively low cost, then that's certainly maybe a potentially relatively cheap form of heating. And coming on to pellet boilers now as well. My mother-in-law has a pellet boiler put in because I persuaded her to. And we're paying about £400 a tonne at the moment for pellets from that. And my calculation on that is that comes out about 8.3p per kilowatt hour gross cost. Now, pellet boilers are more efficient than log stoves. So I think that they're advertised around about 90% efficient. And I think because it is all completely automatically controlled, I have a fairly high degree of confidence that they will be achieving that level of efficiency. And so that works out at just over 9p a kilowatt hour, which is just a smidgen more than the cost of oil, but certainly comparable to the cost of oil. So my feeling is that pellet stoves are a reasonably efficient way of burning wood. And I'm reasonably happy with doing that, but you are still paying slightly more than the cost of oil. In terms of pollution, EST seems to suggest that they are slightly a bit more efficient, a bit less polluting than log stoves and log boilers. I think because they're more controlled. It's all the air supply and so on is controlled automatically. They burn at the optimum temperature and so on. So my feeling is that pellet stoves are better than log stoves in terms of pollution. But the AST's advice is still that all forms of wood heating will be producing some degree of pollution, so one should question it in sensitive situations. Just doing a bit of a comparison of fuel costs and CO2 emissions. Well, first of all, CO2 emissions. So I've got a list there of the CO2 factors for various different fuels. Methane is the best of the fossil fuels at 0.18 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And then going through the sort of heavier fuels down to coal as 0.37 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Now, wood, whenever you look at wood in terms of CO2 emissions on sort of official websites for things like DEFRA and Ofgem and so on, it's given a fairly low emission rate because the assumption is that it will that carbon will be reabsorbed when the tree regrows again. But if you're actually looking at what the carbon emission is from the wood, if you ignore the sort of reabsorption of the carbon, then wood actually produces more CO2 when it burns than coal. So the figure I found on the internet from that particular website I've written there is that you get 0.41 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour from wood compared to 0.37 from coal. So it is the claim that it is reabsorbed that is that allows them to factor in the lower factor, and I'll comment more about that in the next slide. But heat pumps, their emission factor is 0.04, so lower than methane. So in terms of emission factors, well, we'll discuss the wood one in the next slide, but those are the raw numbers there for you to contemplate. In terms of cost, fossil fuel prices have been doing all sorts of strange things recently. 2 or 3 years ago, mains gas would have been by far the cheapest of the fossil fuels, but at the moment oil is actually cheaper than mains gas. And oil, when I just looked this morning, is in fact only about 60p a litre at the moment, which would work out at 6p per kilowatt hour of gross heat. Heat pump would be 12p per kilowatt hour of gross heat if you assume a COP of 3 and a cost of electricity of 36p. And as we saw earlier, the cost of wood very much depends on where you're getting it from, but the £50 dumpy bag is hovering us around about sort of 6 to 9p per kilowatt hour. So wood by the dumpy bag, the cost is sort of within the range of your fossil fuel prices at the moment, but isn't cheaper than your fossil fuels. And in terms of CO2 emissions, it's a question of how you interpret the numbers, I think. The wood has, depending on who you listen to, between 0.01 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour or 0.41 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour, depending on how you think about it. And I will just say a bit more about that on this next slide. So this is quite an interesting graph. I quite like this graph. It's produced by Natural England, and it supposedly shows the amount of carbon sequestered in woodland as woodland develops. So the blue dots are the cumulative carbon sequestered in a woodland as it matures across a 200-year lifetime, and the orange dots are the annual sequestration in your woodland. So if you say had a woodland that was 25 years old, so on the blue dots there, it would have sequestered sort of roughly 500 tons of CO2 per hectare. Now, if you chop that woodland down to turn it into firewood, you effectively take that blue dot back to zero, and it then takes another 25 years to accumulate that carbon again. But if you'd left the tree standing, it would have continued accumulating carbon at a slightly lower rate, but it would have continued accumulating carbon so that by 50 years it had got up to 800 tons of carbon per hectare. So I struggle to agree with the concept that a carbon output from wood can be regarded as zero, because the tree would have continued sequestering carbon if you'd left it standing. I think you can certainly regard it as zero if it's waste wood, but I potentially leave you to interpret these numbers the way you see fit. But my feeling is that if the tree is growing healthily, then you should probably leave it growing healthily. But if it's going to fall over and going to decompose naturally because it's fallen on the forest floor, or it's a byproduct of the sawmill industry, then it probably can be regarded as zero carbon. But it's a very much more complicated a question to answer than I think the simple answer that is often given for zero carbon as a fuel source. So moving on to what types of wood are best to burn. Interesting fact at the start that although we tend to think of hardwoods as being much better for burning than softwoods, in fact, kilowatt hour per kilogram of wood is actually very, very similar, whatever species of wood you look at. So oak has got more heat in it because it's heavier. But if you just take it kilo for kilo, most trees deliver the same amount of heat per kilo of wood. And pretty well most species of trees can be burned. Some are more difficult to light than others. Some sort of splutter and spark more than others. But once you've got it lit, I find that pretty well most things will burn. Only one I'd not want to burn on a fire is laburnum, because that's poisonous and will give off poisonous smoke. But there aren't many other poisonous ones in the UK that you should avoid from that point of view. If you've got a very resinous wood, such as spruce, then it will produce more tars and creosotes. So it's more important to make sure that the fire is hot, that those are fully oxidized. So I would tend to burn very resinous wood with a mixture of other things as well, so that I make sure the fire does burn, not hot. Whoops. And I think it goes without saying that that one should avoid the chipboard and other artificial wood composite materials and paints and preserved woods as well, because they will be giving off other toxic compounds which are fairly bad from the pollution point of view. But in general, if it's just firewood that's a fallen tree, then pretty well most wood is fine to burn. Moving on to air pollution a bit then. So we've mentioned a bit how air pollution is formed, and the bit that seems to be of most concern to scientists and people as a measure of control are these particulates, basically soot, the particles of carbon that are formed as the fuel breaks down and into the carbon chains break up and oxidize. So you get carbon coalescing together, forming tiny particles that are referred to as things like PM10s and PM2.5s. That refers to the size of the particle. And the ones that people seem most concerned about are the very smallest one, the so-called PM2.5s. And they're basically too small for you to really see or even detect. But the worry is that they are so small that they transfer through into the blood system. Now, the study that I was looking at when I was putting this presentation together, there was a study done fairly recently by Sheffield and Nottingham universities that was trying to analyse the impact of wood of log stoves on air pollution. They reckoned that their figure was 38% of air pollution in the UK is from wood and coal burning on home stoves. And in general terms, just in terms of using log fires, the best way of trying to minimize the amount of pollution is the same as trying to burn as efficiently as possible, i.e. to make sure that your fire isn't smoky, that it's as hot as possible, that you have as full combustion and oxidation as you can. But in terms of even if you burn, I think the result that Sheffield came up with is that even if you burn on modern efficient stoves and in the optimum way, then you're still going to get a certain level of these particulate matter produced from a stove. So here it's saying that the WHO recommendations is that there's a 25 microgram per cubic meter of particulates that is they say we should avoid exposing people to. But in the Sheffield research, that people using stoves in their homes were exposed to anything between 27 micrograms and nearly 200 micrograms on average over the period that the stoves are being used. So this is sort of meaning that that yes, if you've got a stove in the house, and here we're talking more about the impact on the residents in the room, in the building that the stove is, rather than the impact of that air pollution in the wider sort of outside. That the element of concern is the level of particulates within the house while the stove is on, and certainly in their study, the levels on average in the houses, within the houses that people were being exposed to, was well above the levels that the World Health Organization is recommending. And a lot of that comes from the periods when the door of the stove is opened, where it's very difficult to avoid these particulates escaping. And again, these are the ones that are so small that you don't really notice them. So you don't have to see a puff of smoke in order for these to escape into the room. They would come out of the log stove, even if you can't necessarily detect them. So their result from their studies were that they regard log stoves as being a potential health hazard, and so that was a result of the Sheffield and Nottingham study. Taking a completely different study the other side of the world in Australia, there is a study here from the Medical Journal of Australia that has come up with pretty much the same result, where they're saying that wood heating is a major source of hazardous air pollution in many Australian citizen towns. So it's not just one study. When you look around, a lot of people seem to be suggesting that air pollution from log stoves is a fairly serious concern. ASME UK also are telling us that they advise against using wood burning stoves especially if you've got lung condition, but generally for because of these particulates and it's the difficulty of avoiding emission of particulates, then they're recommending against log stoves. So yeah, so that's the safety aspect, and I have to admit that during the course of preparing this presentation, I must admit that I have changed my views somewhat. As I said at the start, we use a log stove as our main form of heating, but I think as a result of putting this presentation together, I am starting to have second thoughts about it, and I think I will be looking to try and replace it with something else in the medium term, mainly because of the concern about air pollution that does now seem to be a bit more serious than I had previously anticipated. Just in talking about safety in more general now, if you've got a log stove in your home, it must have an external air supply. A very small number of log stoves have a built-in air supply that takes air directly from outside. Most are what are called sort of open flue devices that take air from the room that they're in. So that room, there must be an air brick or an air vent in that room to supply air. Otherwise, there would be a danger of there being fumes that come back into the room from the flue, with potentially sort of dangerous things like carbon monoxide. Now, so I would also always, if I've got a log stove, have a carbon monoxide detector close by. I don't think that's not a regulation, but it's highly advisable to have a carbon monoxide detector. And bear in mind that carbon monoxide detectors generally do have a sort of a use-by date on them, so check that it's not beyond its use-by date. The surround of the stove has to be of fireproof material. There are special grades of plasterboard that you would use if you're installing a log stove, and the installations have to be notified to building control. I don't think it's essential to use a HETAS certified installer to install a log stove, but I think it's highly recommended that you would do so to make sure that it's done properly, because obviously there are risks of them being installed incorrectly and for fumes to escape and cause a danger to inhabitants. So, right, that's a very rapid rattle through then. So in conclusion, my feeling now is that heat pumps are the most environmentally friendly form of heating. So I think I will be looking to put a heat pump in at some stage. Log stoves are, if you've got cheap logs, a cheap form of heating, then it can be a cheap way of heating your home, but there are these health impacts that you do need to consider. The ideal is to reduce the amount of heat you need to start with. So insulate as much as you can, and then you only need to have a small amount of heat. If you have to have a log stove, then I think put in a modern, efficient one. If yours is old, then it might be worth replacing it with a modern, efficient one. And just in terms of cost, if you are paying for commercial log prices, then it's not any cheaper than gas or oil would be. The importance of making sure that you're burning your fuel efficiently. So you must have a hot fire. That means your logs must be dry, seasoned at least for a year, ideally 2 years if possible, and cutting them to the right size. So I think that's a very rapid, but that's right, yes. So fire one, last one, sorry, I was moving the pictures and all seem to hide the bottom of my screen. So yes, the final one, I think I've sort of been through it before, but because of this need to make sure the fire is hot, most pollution is caused and the most inefficiency is caused if you were to cool fire. So that means basically the old practice of banking up the fire overnight is really not a good thing to do, because that's the way to maximize the amount of pollution that you create and to burn wood with very low efficiency. So if you're using the fire, burn it hot and quickly. Don't try and bank it up or try and turn it right down to smolder, because that will mean that you're producing lots of pollution, lots of soot, and not actually getting much heat from your logs. There we go. Those are my conclusions. I'm just about done. I have no idea how the time has gone on this, but I'm happy to try and take questions if anyone's got some. Shall I finish my screen sharing and then you can have?
Excellent.
There we go.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Yeah, it looks like the chat's been quite busy. I can see Tony scribbling away, getting around those. We did expect this would bring up a few questions and people approaching this from different angles. So yeah, let's see. Take it away, Tony.
Right. Yeah, I'm gonna take these in order. A little bit later on, we'll see if we can have a little bit of a dust up, but all good, useful stuff, no doubt. Well done, Jeremy. Very interesting, informative chat. There's all sorts of bits and pieces here, so we'll see what we can do with these questions. The first one was about masonry storage heater stove. These are very efficient, very good for damp houses. Do you know anything about that? I saw some at a show very recently and they looked absolutely amazing, have fantastic efficiency, but I must be said they were staggeringly expensive.
Yeah, I can't say I can approach it with a very sort of scientific approach, but just the concept of, if you've got a masonry stove, then it means that you can burn your fire hot and quickly to make sure it's burning at maximum efficiency, but then you've got the storage element in there so that once you've gone to bed, then that heat is given out rather slower overnight. So I think they're quite good in enabling you to even out the delivery of heat into the house, but enabling you to burn the wood at optimum efficiency. So yeah, I think that they are probably a good thing.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. The thing about the back boiler and not actually using it, the question here from George is, I was told if it hasn't got water in it, then you need to fill it with sand so that it doesn't crack and you can use it again. Is that true? Do you know?
I was slightly worried about potentially having it leaving it empty and what the consequence would be. It seemed to be fine. Yes, filling it with sand would possibly be a sensible thing to do. I can see that might have benefits, although it's still going to get hot, so I don't really know if it gets as hot as it would be without the sand, because you're not transferring any heat away. Yes, I'm not sure whether that would actually change things very much. My experience was that it seemed to work fine, just leaving it empty. Okay.
Julia has been very daring in this forum and has asked a question about Argas. I mean, surprised they even got mentioned, but oil or gas Arga, how efficient are they? I think not at all / not very is sorry, that's with a back boiler.
I think because they're designed for the back boiler and therefore the heat exchanger is separated from the actual combustion chamber, that they don't suffer the same problem as a log stove, which has got a wraparound boiler. So an Arga or Rayburn is a better way of heating water with the fuel. And so similarly, a log Arga would be designed such that the heat exchanger is separated from the combustion chamber. So yeah, that's a better way of doing it if you're using logs. The question of oil boilers, of oil Argas, is a sort of a slightly different topic, and depends on what sort of Rayburn or Arga you've got. The wick ones are generally a lot less efficient than the vapor jet ones, but yeah, that's probably a topic for a different webinar, I suspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we got into this stuff you were talking about, burning waste wood, provoked both myself and Jackie to have a health and safety panic. Waste wood needs to be untreated, unpainted, though, doesn't it?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And my experience is that trying to burn pallets is an awful lot of effort for not very much heat. So it's depends on where your waste wood comes from.
Okay. A question from Mark about kiln dried logs and how much that improves efficiency. I think we've got to, I'm sure you'll mention it, we've got to flag up what is heating the kiln. If it's lots and lots of electricity, that is questionable. Presumably the best way to dry logs is to stack them up and let the air dry them over a couple of years.
It is, yes. I mean, although I did put that slide up about efficiency with different moisture contents, and in that website, it wasn't actually stated as to whether the one, and there were ones there with a 12% moisture content and 20% moisture content. And I assume the 12% moisture content one is probably a kiln dried one. And there it raised the efficiency from 63% to 66%. So I'm guessing that that is the sort of difference that you're likely to get from having kiln dried wood.
That's interesting. It's not higher, right?
No, it is higher. The 66% was the kiln dried versus 63% for.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I would have thought the difference was greater.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
No.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that was only one experiment of course, but that sounds reasonable to me. It will give you a slightly improved efficiency.
Yeah, okay. Recommendation from Ingrid, which I think is obviously based on price, about wood briquettes. A ton of wood briquettes available for around 400 to 500 pounds. So that it would be, that's half price, presumably, compared to your figures.
Well, yes, I think if you're buying them by the ton, by the pallets, then they're probably similar price to pellets. And again, I think we paid about 400 pounds a ton for those. So yeah, if you buy them by the sort of the smaller quantity from a supermarket or a DIY merchant, they're probably a bit more expensive. So
yes, we should mention, it's probably everybody's aware of this, but the cost in all of these fuels is not so much the fuel itself as the transport. So the greater the quantity you're buying, the cheaper it's going to be, obviously. Right, we've interesting, useful comments about, I think this is to do with your whether you should let a tree grow or chop it down. We've got various comments from knowledgeable folk. There's what about coppice wood, and there's then a comment about pollarding. Pollarding leaves the tree roots growing, so that must be better than total felling. And then Nick from Certainly Wood has mentioned that firewood comes from woodland thinnings, and of course woodlands need to be thinned to allow the trees to grow better and absorb more CO2. So presumably
that's where firewood comes from. Yes, I mean, in terms of the coppicing, looking back at that graph I showed, again what you're doing with coppicing is you are sort of reducing the woodland back to, probably not all the way back to it's the 0 point, but you're continually taking back. So I put up the graph to sort of show what evidence is available. I think it can be interpreted in different ways. The trouble with wood, with logs, with wood fuel, is that it comes from such a wide variety of different sources that is really difficult to generalize about what the carbon footprint of it is, depending on what its route to market is and so on. So one can't make a very precise statement about it. Yes, if they are thinnings, genuinely thinnings, then you're probably fine. And so we burn wood ourselves, and a lot of that comes from what could be regarded as thinnings and so on. So yeah, if you genuinely feel that it is not felling a tree that would have grown for another 50 years, then it's probably fine. So I suppose question where your firewood comes from, maybe. Okay.
On species, there's a couple of questions about elder and yew being poisonous.
I'd heard about elder, and I tried to do some Googling on elder, and some sites sort of say that it's a bit poisonous, and some sites say that there's not much in it. I think in a closed, I probably wouldn't put it on an open fire, but I couldn't find any very strong evidence that it was definitely poisonous, other than sort of people talking about the old wives' tales of summoning up witches and that sort of stuff.
Okay.
You, I'm not sure about. Yes, I'd have to check up on you.
Okay. Right. The 38% figure you quoted as being questioned now is way out of date. Even DEFRA now reports the figure to be 18%, which is still inaccurate.
Well, that study was only about 2 years old, the Sheffield study.
Right.
It probably depends on where in the UK you are, but I'm happy for other evidence to be posted here. But as I say, the Sheffield one was quite recent.
Yeah, I suppose It's worth flagging up. I mean, this was entitled a hot topic because we knew it would generate some debate, and there's certainly been some in the chat. So John Cook has mentioned the Guardian article, which the sort of the banner trying to attract attention. Who would have thought journalists would do that? Is saying that wood burning in homes in the UK now produces more small particle pollution than all road traffic in the UK. People in the chat have not agreed with that. Do you want to jump in there, Jeremy?
It's hard to, well, there's various studies that come up with different results, and it's I don't know how one decides which is the definitive source or not. In general, there is an element of quite a bit of concern in many of the articles that particles, whatever the actual number is, a lot of people are flagging it up as being of concern.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just to say, if you want an alternative view, if you go to Certainly Wood, Nick and Sandra are from Certainly Wood. They are Herefordshire-based wood suppliers, so they're going to take a certain viewpoint, I suppose, but that doesn't mean they're not accurate. There are blogs and things on their website, certainlywood.co.uk. So have a read around the subject, and yeah, form your own opinions. A point from Ingrid, which might help on this. The EU is now only allowing wood burners with certain high-grade filters. Is this happening in the UK?
Well,
what sort of solution is there other than just not burning wood at all?
Now you have to install log stoves that have this eco-design certification. So presumably, and I think that's partly to limit the particulates, but there are no controls over what, there's nothing to stop people using older stoves if they're already installed. But yes, there are now regulations on what sort of stove you can burn, and I think the new ones are better. So I think if there is concern about this, then it'd be worth installing one of the newer eco-design stoves, I think.
Okay. There's a question here. If particulates are escaping into the room when the door is open, doesn't it suggest there's a problem with the stove drawing properly? I mean, even the most efficient stove is still going to produce some residue, isn't
yes,
it?
I pondered about this because, yes, in theory, if the stove is drawing properly, then you would expect there to be a effectively negative pressure inside the stove at all times, and therefore certainly in use you wouldn't expect, even if the stove has got holes in it, you would expect there to be those holes to be drawing air into the stove rather than emitting fumes out of the stove. These numbers, I think, were basically the experimental numbers that they got from that study. So I think that's where they do, and I think what they also discovered was that when they were looking at the levels of particulates in the rooms, they found spikes whenever the door was open. So I think that evidence was from the experimental data. I agree, it seems to be slightly contradictory to the idea that the stove is basically drawing air in at all stages. But I think even if you open the door, even if there is slight negative pressure in the stove, the turbulence that you generate when you open a door is going to waft some fumes out into the room. I think that's probably where it must come from.
Right. Okay. You mentioned heat pumps. I'm very conscious this is not a heat pump webinar. We've got plenty of those recorded, so do have a look at those on YouTube. But as it's in the chat and it's available for everyone to see, there's a comment that UK homes don't allow for heat pumps to be as efficient as they could be. I'm afraid that is a fundamental misunderstanding. The heat pumps are highly efficient. The heat pumps would typically be 300 to 400% efficient. It is the UK homes that are not efficient. You can heat anything with a heat pump as long as you have a big enough heat pump and a big enough radiator, but the fabric of the building may mean that you're losing the heat rapidly. So it's not the heat pump's fault. Anyway, we'll move on. Your back boiler, specific question about yours, is it steel or cast iron?
I would imagine it's steel, and I won't mention the brand of log stove because I suspect it applies to many of them, but I mean, it was a fairly modern one. It was well, I guess it's 20 years old now, but it would have been new 20 years ago.
Okay. Just an issue about kiln drying firewood. Nick at Certainly Wood again commenting that they use waste wood to fire their kilns to dry the logs. So something circular about that. Some complicated questions, sorry. Carbon sequestration seems to peak in the first couple of years. Does this favor regular coppicing for maximum speed of sequestration by any area of woodland, or is this balanced out by the lower heat generation by thinner logs? Question.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. Yes, you're quite right that in that graph it showed that the sort of greatest rate of sequestration seems to be sort of in the first, well, it was slow to start with, but then between years 5 and 10 was the greatest rate of sequestration. And then after that, the rate sort of gradually declines. So I guess from that point of view, if you are coppicing, then probably doing so after 10 years is probably about the right period to do so. I'm not sure I can really comment more specifically on that.
Okay, fine. I think one lot of statistic includes bonfires and barbecues in domestic wood burning. Is that, do you know anything about that? So not just wood burning.
The statistics on what element? The pollution element? Presumably,
yes.
Right, okay. Well, that presumably is part of the when they're talking about the 38% or whatever number you choose of air pollution in the UK. I suspect that must probably include the bonfires and barbecues. But in terms of the Sheffield study, what they were specifically looking at there was the level of particulates within the room that the stove was in, which presumably comes from the stove itself.
Yeah. Okay. Another one about filters. What do you know about particular filters that fit to the chimney top that work electrostatically? Scheidel makes one and claim that it removes 95% of the 2.5 particles. I read they're well known elsewhere in European countries.
I don't know much about those. That might be something that it would be worth trying to follow up with. I will try and look into that a bit more and circulate some information, because that is an interesting question.
Okay. Any more questions? Because we have run out. I think we're just about there. Well done, Jeremy. There was all sorts of interesting stuff there in the chat. Thank you. I have to leave. That was interesting. Can the slides be circulated? That's one of our favorite questions. I know the answer to that one.
Ingrid's still got a hand up. Is that a new question, Ingrid?
Sorry, I just wanted to comment on these masonry stoves, because the difference between these masonry stoves and other wood burners is that they actually store the heat. So we fire it up in the morning and it heats the house throughout the day, and then we fire it up again in the evening. So you have the constant heat output from this stove. Then you only open the door twice a day, which means that you do not get the pollution indoors. And then the smoke goes around the firebox, which means that the smoke coming out of the chimney is almost cool. And so you also don't get the pollution as it is burned really, really hot when you start burning it. And and I mentioned the damp house. You keep the house at a certain level of heat because the walls are all being warmed up all the time. And then, of course, if your house is insulated, then you have an ideal situation. And then, of course, you can also have the water heated up, which doesn't need a back boiler. It just goes up in pipes. So we decided to put that money in instead of buying a new oil boiler, which we would have had to do because the house we bought was old and the oil boiler was broken. and that would have cost about the same, including the oil tank. So for us, it was a brilliant solution.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are various European types of masonry stoves that are being quoted in the chat. Question: are they related to rocket stoves? I think that's totally something
No, rocket stove is something
different.
different. Yeah,
That's about the way the combustion takes effect.
Yeah.
I think at that point we'll wrap up the chat. Thank you very much, everybody who contributed. The answer to the question, can the slides be circulated, is yes. The webinar has been recorded and will be available on the HGN YouTube channel. But I'll hand over to Jem to explain all about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you. Yeah, really interesting Q&A session there. So thanks to everyone. And yes, everything will be circulated. You'll get a follow-up email with the recording. And as Tony said as well, we record all of our sessions. So all previous webinars you can get access to, which actually includes a wood burning stoves or burning wood webinar from a year or so ago, which had quite a strong focus on safety. That if you want to do a bit more watching, you might want to catch up on that. So I'll circulate that too. Just to have a quick run through before you go of what else is coming up. I mentioned that Future Ready Homes has a whole series of webinars coming up, which we will be supporting and hosting here. Keeping cool at home in a warming climate, that one's going to be coming up soon. We've got low cost measures plans, some retrofit case studies, the actual homes. We're going to try and get a good mixture there of housing types, so there's something there for everyone. So yeah, there are plenty coming up, and if there's something that you would particularly like to see or have expanded upon, let us know and we'll see if we can put something on. We are ultimately here to give you the information that you're looking for to help you make decisions about what to do with your homes. So it's so much easier if you tell us what you'd like to hear. We've also got Green Doors coming up, which again I mentioned earlier. Please save the date. It's 14th and 15th. It's in October, 3 weekends, the 14th, 15th, 21st, 22nd, 28th and 29th of October. And we're spreading it out that way to give you maximum opportunity to see plenty of homes rather than keeping to just one weekend. So yeah, it should give you a bit more flexibility. For those of you that have never heard of it at all, it's been a really, really popular event that we've been running. Well, it's been running on and off in Herefordshire and Shropshire for quite some time actually, and this is in Powys as well. But it provides the opportunity for you to have a look around a home which has already been retrofitted and talk to householders that have been on that journey already. So it's a really informal way of just having that chat, getting some confidence and understanding, and helping you with your research and decision making that you've got to do. And actually, the homeowners have really loved doing it as well. They really enjoyed opening their doors up and welcoming in like-minded people and being able to support them. So if you guys have retrofitted your home, Ingrid, you are in my mind. Would you, if you'd be interested in opening your home up and letting other people in, please let us know. We would love to see a retrofitted home open on every single street corner to inspire others to do the same. So I'll give you some details about how you can get involved with that as well. And then finally, ask an expert. So Future Ready Homes are also supporting by not just webinars, but giving best practice advice. They've got a whole team of experts, panel of architects, structural engineers, heritage specialists, all sorts that are part of this project. And they would like to give out good retrofit advice. So if you've got questions, specific retrofit questions, ask away. We're not saying we're going to be able to answer all of them, but the most commonly asked questions we're going to answer and they're going to go up on the Future Ready Homes website. So yeah, if you've been pondering what are the best materials to use for your retrofit, or how do I insulate sloping ceiling, what is heat pump ready, is my home ready to switch to a heat pump, or any specific questions that have come up today as well, please send them in and we'll see if we can get them answered for you. And yes, it's not just you that will be answering, we'll be making those available to everyone. So it's all about shared learning and you won't be the only ones asking the questions. that's how you can get in contact with us, with Building Sense at hgnnetwork.org. You can have a look on HGN website, and then just a reminder, there is futurereadyhomes.org.uk as well. That website is well worth a look to have get a bit more information about the free plans, the Ask an Expert, Bring Doors, and everything else that they've got coming up. But I will have all of this on an email to you, so please don't think you have to memorize it or be scribbling away. I just wanted to let you know about those things coming up. That's it. Thank you ever so much for spending almost an hour and a half of your time with us. Really hope you found that useful.